The alien queen had never known fear. She ruled over galaxies, commanded armies, and crushed rebellions with a flick of her hand. Her people considered her invincible, a symbol of power and dominance. But none of that mattered now. Her ship, once the pride of the Zarnak fleet, lay in smoking ruins on an unknown primitive planet, Earth. The crash had been sudden, violent. One moment, she was traveling through hyperspace, and the next, her systems failed without warning. Her escape pod ejected at the last second, plummeting her into the dense forests of this backwater world. Now, trapped under twisted metal and debris, she felt something she had never experienced before: pain. Her heart, a biosynthetic fusion reactor, sputtered weakly inside her chest. Her vision blurred. The air was thick, strange, not suited for her lungs. She knew her time was running out. But then, footsteps. She tensed, ready to fight. But what emerged from the tree line wasn't a soldier or a rival alien. It was a human, a primitive. He was tall, rugged, and covered in dirt. No armor, no advanced technology, just simple clothes and a curious expression. He moved closer, pushing aside the debris as if he didn't recognize the threat in front of him. She tried to raise a hand to warn him off, but her strength failed. Instead of fleeing, the human knelt beside her, inspecting her wounds with surprising calm. "You're hurt," he said softly, his voice filled with concern, not fear. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. This creature, this primitive, was trying to help her. The alien queen's mind raced. Why wasn't he afraid? Any other species would have run in terror at the sight of her. But this human, he didn't see a queen. He saw someone in need. He carefully lifted her from the wreckage, his touch gentle but strong. She wanted to resist, to scream at the indignity of being handled like a fragile thing, but the warmth of his hands seeped into her cold skin. He carried her through the forest, murmuring words she couldn't understand, but the softness in his voice soothed her racing heart. He brought her to a small shelter, nothing like the grand chamber she was used to. The walls were made of wood and stone, the air filled with the scent of earth and fire. It was primitive, yes, but comforting. The human worked quickly, using strange herbs and plants to treat her wounds. She watched him, fascinated. His techniques were crude compared to the advanced medical technology of her people, but somehow they worked. The pain in her body eased, and her breathing steadied. As the hours passed, she realized something terrifying. She owed her life to this human. Lying there, in a simple bed, she stared at the ceiling and wondered, why did he save me? What did he gain from helping a stranger, an alien? And more importantly, what will he do when he realizes who I really am? For the first time in her life, the alien queen felt something new, a spark of curiosity, and beneath it, a flicker of fear. The alien queen awoke to the soft crackle of a fire, its warmth rushing against her chilled skin. The dim glow cast flickering shadows on the rough wooden walls of the human's shelter. She lay still, her mind racing as she tried to process the events of the previous day. She was alive. That fact alone was a miracle, not because her injuries were beyond repair, but because the one who saved her was the very being her people considered inferior, a human. Her body ached, but it was different from before. The sharp, burning pain had dulled, replaced by a steady, manageable throb. She glanced down at her wounds, expecting to see crude, ineffective attempts at care. But what she saw stunned her. The injuries were healing. The human had wrapped her wounds with strips of cloth, smeared them with a strange greenish paste from the plants he had gathered. She could feel her body responding, knitting itself back together in a way she hadn't expected. For a species considered primitive, this human had done something remarkable. Her people, the Zarnak, relied on advanced technology to heal, machines and biogels that could close wounds in seconds. But this man had used nothing but nature and his own two hands, and it was working. She turned her head slowly, her sharp eyes landing on the human. He sat by the fire, his face illuminated by the soft light, his features relaxed but focused. He was carefully grinding more of the same plants into a paste, his hands moving with practiced ease. He didn't notice she was awake, or perhaps he did and simply didn't care. There was no fear in him, no hesitation. It confused her. The Zarnak had always believed humans were fragile, weak creatures barely surviving on a planet that was harsh and unforgiving. Their technology was primitive, their understanding of the universe laughable. But this man, this primitive, had managed to do what no Zarnak healer could have done in his position. He had saved her without machines, without advanced science, just knowledge and instinct. She tried to sit up, but the effort sent a sharp pain through her side. A low, involuntary hiss escaped her lips. The human's head snapped toward her, his eyes locking onto hers. For a brief moment, they stared at each other in silence. Two beings from different worlds, caught in a situation neither had expected. "You're awake," he said softly, his voice calm and steady. She didn't understand his words, but his tone was soothing. He moved toward her, hands raised slightly, showing he meant no harm. She tensed, instinctively prepared to defend herself, but her body betrayed her. She was too weak. He knelt beside her, his warm hands gently pressing against her shoulder to ease her back down. She could have tried to resist, but something in his touch stopped her. It wasn't dominance or control. It was care. Genuine, unfiltered care. "Why?" He spoke again, words flowing in a language foreign to her, but the meaning wasn't lost. His eyes, his voice, his touch, all conveyed the same message. "You're safe." For the first time, the alien queen felt a strange sense of vulnerability, not because she was weak, but because she didn't understand this human. His actions made no sense. Why save her? What did he hope to gain? Among her people, everything was a transaction. Power was traded, loyalty was bought, and kindness was a tool for manipulation. But this human, he expected nothing in return. As the days passed, the queen watched him closely. Despite her growing strength, she pretended to be weaker than she was, observing him with sharp, calculating eyes. He continued to care for her, bringing food, tending to the fire, and applying his strange medicines. But what fascinated her most wasn't his actions. It was his resilience. The human would venture into the forest daily, gathering herbs, hunting small animals, and facing dangers that would have made lesser beings cower. He had no advanced weapons, no protective armor, just simple tools and an unbreakable will. When he returned with cuts and bruises, he treated himself with the same calm efficiency he used on her. Pain didn't seem to faze him. One evening, as the firelight danced across the walls, the queen found herself studying his face. He was different from the Zarnak males, rougher, but there was strength in that ruggedness. Not just physical strength, but something deeper, a strength of spirit. She had never seen that before, not in her people, not in her enemies. It intrigued her and unsettled her. She began to question everything she had been taught. How could a species so primitive produce someone like him? Someone who didn't just survive in harsh conditions but thrived. Someone who could look death in the face and keep moving forward. As her body healed, so did her perspective. The human wasn't just a random anomaly. He was proof that humanity had something the Zarnak didn't understand, something powerful. And that realization sent a shiver down her spine. Because if one human could be this strong, what else were they capable of? Far from the quiet forests of Earth, in the cold, metallic chambers of the Zarnak flagship, the alien king's fury echoed through the vast hallways. His voice, deep and thunderous, sent tremors through the hearts of his advisors and soldiers alike. The queen was missing. His mate, the most powerful being in the Zarnak Empire, had vanished without a trace. The last communication from her ship had been garbled, a distress signal that cut off abruptly. For the king, there was only one conclusion. The humans were responsible. He refused to believe that a simple mechanical failure or cosmic accident had brought down the Queen's vessel. No, it had to be sabotage, an act of defiance from the primitive species they had long underestimated. With a snarl, the king slammed his clawed fist onto the command console, cracking the reinforced metal. His eyes, burning with rage, scanned the holographic map of Earth. "Prepare the fleet," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "We will turn their planet into ashes." Back on Earth, the alien queen was regaining her strength, unaware of the storm brewing in the skies above. She moved more easily now, her wounds nearly healed, thanks to the humans' relentless care. But her mind was far from at ease. She had spent hours, even days, watching the human as he went about his routines. Each action, each decision he made, was a puzzle she couldn't solve. He had saved her life, treated her wounds, and asked for nothing in return. But she knew her people. They would not see this as an act of kindness. They would see it as an insult, a weakness. If the king believed she had been captured, or worse, humiliated, by a human, his retaliation would be swift and merciless. The thought sent a chill through her, one she couldn't shake off. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the queen decided it was time. She needed to confront the human, to understand his intentions. She found him by the fire, sharpening a crude blade made from stone and metal. He looked up as she approached, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. That simple gesture, so warm, so human, threw her off balance. She pointed to herself, then to the stars, trying to convey her message through gestures. He watched her, his brow furrowing in thought. Then, understanding flickered in his eyes. He nodded slowly and pointed to the sky, mimicking the ship crashing down. His expression turned serious, and he placed a hand on his chest, then pointed at her, as if saying, "You're safe here." But the queen wasn't concerned about her safety anymore. She was worried about his. She tried again, more urgently this time, mimicking an explosion, drawing invisible ships in the air, and then pointing to him. The human's eyes darkened with realization. He understood. Danger was coming. Just as the weight of her warning settled between them, the ground beneath their feet trembled. A low, distant hum grew louder, vibrating through the trees. The queen's heart dropped. They were here. The Zarnak fleet had arrived. The human stood, his eyes scanning the horizon. Bright lights pierced the night sky, descending rapidly toward the forest. The queen grabbed his arm, her grip tight and desperate. For the first time, she felt fear, not for herself, but for him. He had no idea what he was up against. But the human didn't panic. Instead, he placed his hand over hers, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Then, without a word, he moved swiftly into action. He gathered supplies, weapons, and whatever tools he could find, preparing for what was to come. The queen watched in stunned silence. This human, faced with an alien invasion, didn't run. He stood his ground. As the first Zarnak scouts landed, the queen and the human hid in the shadows, watching. The alien soldiers, towering and armored, scanned the area with cold, calculating eyes. They spoke in a language the human couldn't understand, but the queen heard every word. They were searching for her, and they would destroy anything in their path to get to her. She turned to the human, her eyes filled with urgency. She needed him to understand that staying meant certain death. But before she could gesture again, he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not leaving you." The words hit her harder than any weapon could. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She had been prepared to manipulate him if needed, to ensure her own survival. But this was something else. He wasn't helping her out of obligation or fear. He was choosing to stay because it was the right thing to do. But his choice would cost him everything. The queen knew she had to act fast. She couldn't let him sacrifice himself for her. As the Zarnak scouts moved deeper into the forest, she made a decision that went against every instinct she had. She would protect him. The alien queen, ruler of galaxies, would stand between this human and the wrath of her own people. But just as she prepared to reveal herself and lead the soldiers away, something unexpected happened. She caught sight of the human, standing just a few feet away from one of the scouts, talking to them. Her heart stopped. From her hidden spot, she could see his hands moving, gesturing in an attempt to communicate. The Zarnak soldier tilted its head, seemingly confused but not hostile. The queen's mind raced. Had he betrayed her? Was this his plan all along, to gain her trust and then hand her over? The realization hit her like a cold wave. She had been foolish to trust a primitive. Her people were right. Humans were not to be trusted. But as the queen watched, something didn't add up. The human wasn't pleading for his life or trying to strike a deal. Instead, he pointed in the opposite direction, leading the scouts away from their shelter. Within moments, the soldiers disappeared into the forest, following the human's false trail. The queen's breath caught in her throat. He hadn't betrayed her. He had saved her again. As the danger temporarily passed, the human returned, his face calm but his eyes alert. The queen didn't know what to say, or even if she could find the words. But deep inside, something shifted. This human, this primitive, had risked everything for her without expecting anything in return. And now she owed him more than her life. She owed him her trust. The night settled over the forest like a heavy shroud, thick with tension and unspoken questions. The alien queen sat in the flickering glow of the fire, her sharp eyes never leaving the human as he moved about the small shelter. The events of the day replayed in her mind like a broken recording. His encounter with the Zarnak scouts, the way he'd stood face to face with them, speaking in a language they couldn't understand, and then leading them away. She wanted to believe he had done it to protect her, that his strange sense of honor wouldn't allow him to betray the one he had saved. But a voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts. Why risk himself for an alien he barely knew? What if it was all a ruse? What if even now he was leading her into a trap, earning her trust just to deliver her to the Zarnak forces for a reward? Her people would pay handsomely for her return. She was the queen, after all, the most valuable asset in the galaxy. And humans, as far as the Zarnak were concerned, were opportunistic creatures, always looking for a way to climb the ladder of survival. The human didn't seem aware of her internal struggle. He moved quietly, tending to the fire, sharpening his crude weapons, and checking the perimeter of the shelter as if he expected the Zarnak scouts to return at any moment. His calmness unnerved her. Was it confidence, or the assurance of someone who knew the outcome because he had already set the wheels in motion? Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, the queen decided to test him. As he returned from checking the edge of the forest, she stood, slowly, painfully, but with purpose. Her strength had returned enough to hold her ground, though she still felt the dull ache of her healing wounds. The human noticed her movement and approached, concern flickering in his eyes. "You shouldn't be up yet," he said gently, motioning for her to sit back down. She didn't move. Instead, she narrowed her eyes, pointing a sharp, clawed finger at him, then toward the direction where the Zarnak scouts had gone. Her posture was rigid, her meaning clear. "What did you say to them?" The human's brow furrowed in confusion at first, but then understanding dawned. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace, shaking his head. "I didn't betray you," he said, his voice firm but soft. "I led them away, so you'd be safe." But words meant little to her now. Trust was not something easily given, especially not when her life was on the line. She stepped closer, her expression darkening, silently demanding the truth. The tension between them thickened, the firelight casting long shadows that danced like specters on the walls of the shelter. The human sighed, realizing words alone wouldn't be enough to convince her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small battered object, a communicator from one of the Zarnak scouts. He tossed it to her feet. The queen stared at it, then back at him, her mind racing. "I took it," he explained, his tone steady. "So they can't call for backup. They're wandering blind out there." The queen picked up the device, examining it with practiced precision. It was indeed disabled, its circuits fried in a way that even Zarnak technology couldn't easily repair. The implications of his actions hit her like a tidal wave. He hadn't just distracted the scouts, he had crippled their ability to regroup and call for reinforcements. For a long moment, she said nothing, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of this primitive human with the reality before her. His actions weren't just brave. They were strategic. He understood more about warfare and survival than she had ever given his species credit for. But still, a flicker of doubt remained. What if this was all part of a larger plan? What if he was playing a long game, waiting until she was fully healed before delivering her to the Zarnak for an even greater reward? Her instincts screamed at her to be cautious, yet beneath the layers of suspicion, something else stirred. An unfamiliar, unsettling emotion that she couldn't quite name. Could it be trust, or something deeper? Before she could explore those thoughts further, a sudden explosion rocked the forest, the ground trembling beneath their feet. The queen's heart leaped into her throat. The Zarnak were back, and this time, they weren't sending scouts. The human's face hardened with determination. He grabbed his makeshift weapons and looked at her, his eyes burning with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "We have to move," he said, his voice low but urgent. He didn't wait for her to respond. He simply acted, gathering supplies and preparing for what was to come. The queen hesitated, her mind torn between fear, suspicion, and an undeniable pull toward the man who had saved her life. Twice, she had faced countless battles, crushed entire rebellions, and stared down death more times than she could count. But this was different. For the first time, she wasn't sure if the greatest threat was outside the shelter, or standing right beside her. And yet, as the sounds of the approaching Zarnak forces grew louder, the queen made a decision that surprised even herself. She followed him. Not because she had no choice, but because, deep down, some part of her believed he wouldn't lead her into a trap. Some part of her believed in him, and that terrified her more than any enemy ever could. The forest, once a sanctuary of quiet rustling leaves and distant animal calls, had transformed into a battlefield cloaked in shadows and tension. The alien queen and the human moved swiftly, weaving through dense foliage, their breaths quiet but heavy with anticipation. Above them, the night sky glowed faintly with the eerie lights of Zarnak scout ships, their engines humming like predators circling their prey. The queen's mind raced with every step. She had fought in countless battles, commanded fleets across galaxies, but this was different. She wasn't leading an army of elite soldiers or wielding advanced weaponry. She was relying on a single human, a primitive, armed with nothing more than makeshift tools and sheer determination. It was absurd, and yet it was working. They reached a clearing where the human stopped abruptly. He crouched low, his eyes scanning the terrain with a keen awareness that surprised her. He pointed to the ground, where faint depressions marked the passage of Zarnak patrols. The queen recognized the signs immediately. They were surrounded. But the human didn't panic. Instead, he studied the paths like a predator tracking its prey, a plan forming in his mind. Without words, he motioned for her to follow. They circled back toward a narrow ravine, its steep sides offering both cover and an opportunity. The queen realized his intention instantly. He was setting a trap. Using vines and sharp stones, the human crafted rudimentary snares and pitfalls. It was crude, laughably so compared to the sophisticated tactics of the Zarnak military. But the queen couldn't deny the effectiveness of his methods. He understood the land, the patterns of the enemy, and how to use both to their advantage. For a species considered primitive, this human was anything but. As they worked, the queen found herself watching him closely. His focus never wavered, his movements precise and efficient. There was no hesitation, no fear, only the calm determination of someone who had faced death before and refused to bow to it. She had seen that look in the eyes of her best warriors, but it was different in him. His strength wasn't born from training or technology. It came from within. The first sign of the enemy came with a faint rustle of leaves and the metallic click of Zarnak armor brushing against the undergrowth. The human gave her a quick glance, a silent signal that it was time. They slipped into the shadows, hiding among the rocks and trees as the patrol approached. The Zarnak soldiers moved with mechanical precision, their glowing visors scanning the dark for any sign of life. But they didn't expect traps. They didn't expect resistance from a human. The first soldier fell into a concealed pit, its armored body crashing against sharpened stakes below. The others whirled in confusion, their weapons raised. But it was too late. The human struck from the shadows, his blade slicing through the vulnerable joints in their armor. The queen watched, stunned, as he moved with a predator's grace, exploiting weaknesses even she hadn't considered. When the last soldier fell, the clearing was silent once more. The human stood over the fallen, his chest rising and falling with exertion, but his eyes were steady, unwavering. The queen stepped out from her hiding spot, her gaze locked on him. She had fought alongside the fiercest warriors in the galaxy, but none had impressed her like this. He was more than just a survivor. He was a fighter. But the battle wasn't over. The sound of engines grew louder, and the queen knew the Zarnak would soon realize their patrols were missing. They would send more troops, heavier artillery. The traps wouldn't work twice. "We can't stay here," the human said, his voice low but resolute. He glanced at her, his eyes searching for understanding. She nodded, realizing that for the first time, they were truly in this together. They moved deeper into the forest, heading toward higher ground. The human explained, through gestures and broken words, that he knew of a place where they could make a final stand, a narrow mountain pass where the enemy's numbers wouldn't matter. The queen followed, her mind racing with strategies and possibilities. As they climbed, she began to share her knowledge. Using the dirt and stones, she drew diagrams of Zarnak tactics, explaining their weaknesses through gestures and expressions. The human listened intently, absorbing every detail. It was a strange, silent partnership, forged not through trust, but through necessity and mutual respect. By the time they reached the pass, dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting the landscape in a pale, golden light. The queen stood at the edge, looking down at the forest below. The Zarnak forces were gathering, their ships hovering like dark shadows against the morning sky. The human approached, his expression serious but calm. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. She didn't flinch this time. Instead, she placed her hand over his, acknowledging the bond they had formed. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they weren't outmatched. Together, they prepared for the final battle, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. The queen, once a ruler who saw humans as insignificant, now stood beside one, ready to fight for survival, not just for herself, but for the man who had shown her a strength no technology could replicate. As the enemy approached, the queen felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not fear, but hope. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't fighting alone. The morning sun crept over the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the narrow mountain pass where the alien queen and the human prepared to make their stand. The chill in the air was sharp, but neither of them felt it. Their focus was locked on the horizon, where the distant hum of Zarnak engines grew louder with each passing minute. The sound echoed off the rocky cliffs, a grim reminder of the force descending upon them. The queen's heart beat steadily in her chest, the synthetic pulse of her bioreactor sensing with the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had faced death before, led armies into impossible battles. But this was different. This time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting beside someone she had once considered beneath her, a human. The man stood next to her, his eyes sharp, his expression calm but fierce. His makeshift armor, pieced together from scraps of metal and leather, glinted in the morning light. It wasn't advanced, not by Zarnak standards, but it was a testament to his resilience and resourcefulness. The Queen had come to respect that about him. He didn't need advanced technology or superior firepower. His strength came from something deeper, an unbreakable will. They had spent the night preparing, setting traps, and fortifying their position. The narrow pass worked to their advantage, funneling the enemy into a confined space where their numbers wouldn't matter as much. The Queen had shared everything she knew about Zarnak tactics, while the human had introduced her to Earth's guerrilla strategies, primitive but devastatingly effective. Together, they had crafted a plan that blended the best of both worlds. But as the first Zarnak ships appeared over the ridge, the Queen felt a familiar tension tighten in her chest. The alien king was here. His flagship hovered above the battlefield, a monstrous vessel of black metal and glowing red lights, casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the sky. The Queen's breath caught in her throat. She could feel his presence even before she saw him. The king was more than her mate. He was her rival, her equal in power and ruthlessness. And now, he was her enemy. The human noticed the change in her posture and followed her gaze to the massive ship looming overhead. He didn't need an explanation. He knew who was aboard. Without a word, they positioned themselves at the front of the pass, side by side, waiting as the Zarnak forces descended. The soldiers moved with mechanical precision, their black armor gleaming in the sunlight, their weapons raised and ready. But the Queen noticed something different in their formation. This wasn't just a mission to retrieve her. This was an execution. The king wasn't here to bring her back. He was here to make an example out of her. And then he appeared. The alien king descended from his flagship in a beam of red light, his towering figure casting a long shadow across the battlefield. His armor was darker than the void of space, adorned with symbols of conquest and power. His eyes, glowing with a cold, merciless light, locked onto the Queen. When he spoke, his voice echoed through the pass, amplified by his suit's technology. "You've fallen far, my Queen," he sneered, his gaze shifting to the human beside her. "Saved by a primitive. You disgrace yourself and our empire." The Queen's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. Her stance, her defiance, spoke louder than any words could. The king's expression darkened. "I'll give you a choice," he continued, his voice dripping with malice. "Kill the human and return to your rightful place by my side, or die with him." The human's grip tightened on his weapon, but he didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the Queen. He knew the weight of the decision she faced, but he didn't try to influence it. He had saved her life twice, fought beside her, and now he was prepared to die without asking for anything in return. The Queen's mind raced. The logical choice was clear. Return to the king, reclaim her throne, and secure her power. But as she looked at the human, this man who had risked everything for her without expecting a reward, she felt something shift inside her. For the first time in her life, power didn't matter. The throne, the empire, the endless conquests, they all felt hollow compared to the bond she had forged with this human. It wasn't just gratitude. It was respect. It was trust. It was something more. The king stepped forward, his weapon humming with deadly energy. "Choose, my Queen," he snarled, raising his arm, "or I will choose for you." The Queen took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, without hesitation, she raised her weapon, not at the human, but at the king. "I have chosen," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I choose him." The king's eyes widened in shock, but before he could react, the Queen fired. The blast struck his weapon, sending it flying from his grasp. The battlefield erupted into chaos as the Zarnak soldiers charged, but the Queen and the human were ready. They fought side by side, their movements a perfect blend of alien precision and human grit. The Queen's advanced combat skills complemented the human's raw, unyielding strength. Together, they were unstoppable, cutting through the enemy ranks with a fury that left the Zarnak forces reeling. The king roared in anger, charging at the Queen with nothing but his bare fists. They clashed in a brutal, ferocious battle, their strikes shaking the ground beneath them. The human fought his way through the chaos, refusing to leave her side. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they weren't outmatched. As the fight reached its climax, the queen saw an opening. With a final, powerful strike, she brought the king to his knees. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with disbelief and rage. "You've doomed yourself," he spat, "choosing the human over your empire. You're a fool." The queen stared down at him, her expression calm. "I haven't doomed myself," she replied. "I freed myself." With that, she delivered the final blow, ending the king's reign once and for all. The battlefield fell silent as the remaining Zarnak soldiers retreated, their morale shattered by the death of their leader. The queen stood over the king's lifeless body, her chest heaving with exhaustion and relief. The human approached, his face smeared with dirt and blood, but his eyes bright with victory. They looked at each other, and for the first time since their fateful meeting, they smiled. The queen knew her life would never be the same. She couldn't return to the Zarnak Empire, not after what she had done. But she didn't care. She had found something far more valuable than power. She had found someone who saw her not as a queen, but as an equal. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden hues over the battlefield that had, just hours ago, been a place of chaos and bloodshed. Now, the only sounds were the soft rustling of the wind through the trees and the distant hum of retreating Zarnak ships disappearing into the atmosphere. The alien queen stood still, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the last traces of her former empire faded from view. It was over. The body of the alien king lay at her feet, a dark, crumpled figure against the rocky ground. The man who had once ruled galaxies, commanded armies, and shared her throne was now just another casualty in a war that had ended the moment she made her choice. She had chosen the human, not just in that moment of defiance, but in everything that had followed, the battles they fought side by side, the risks they took, the trust they built. The human stood beside her, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion, his clothes torn and bloodied. His eyes, though tired, held a quiet strength. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between them was filled with understanding, a bond forged in the fires of survival and solidified through unspoken respect. As the last Zarnak ship vanished into the clouds, the queen felt a strange emptiness settle in her chest. She was free from the chains of her empire, freed from the expectations and burdens of her crown, but freedom came with a price. She had no home to return to. The Zarnak would see her as a traitor, a ruler who had abandoned her people for a species they deemed inferior. She was an exile, a queen without a throne. But when she looked at the human, she realized something profound. She didn't need a throne. They began the slow journey back to the shelter where it had all started. The forest, once filled with danger, now felt like a sanctuary. The human led the way, navigating the familiar paths with ease. The queen followed, her steps lighter than they had been in years. She felt the weight of her old life falling away with each mile they covered, replaced by something new, possibility. When they reached the shelter, it looked almost untouched by the chaos that had unfolded beyond the trees. The fire pit was cold, the simple wooden walls standing firm against the wind. It was a stark contrast to the grand palaces and sprawling cities of the Zarnak Empire. But to the queen, it felt more like home than any place she had ever known. The human set down his gear and began to tend to the fire, his movements slow but steady. The queen watched him, her mind racing with questions she had never thought to ask. Who was this man who had risked everything for her? What drove him to fight with such unwavering courage? And most importantly, what did the future hold for them now? As the fire crackled to life, the human finally spoke, his voice breaking the silence. "What will you do now?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the flames. The queen didn't answer immediately. She stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the empire she had left behind, the battles she had fought, the choices she had made. And then she thought about the man sitting beside her, the human who had shown her that strength wasn't just about power, but about heart. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice softer than she expected. "But I know I can't go back." The human nodded, as if he had expected that answer. He didn't offer solutions or promises. He simply accepted her decision, respecting her choice as he had respected every choice she had made since they met. That, more than anything, solidified her belief in him. He didn't see her as a queen. He saw her as an equal. Days turned into weeks as they settled into a new rhythm. The queen adapted quickly to life on Earth, her advanced knowledge blending with the humans' practical skills. They built a stronger shelter, hunted, and gathered food, and even began to cultivate a small garden. It was simple, almost primitive by Zarnak standards, but it was peaceful. But peace didn't mean stagnation. The queen's mind was always working, always planning. She knew the Zarnak wouldn't forget her betrayal. Sooner or later, they would send more forces, determined to erase the stain she had left on their empire. But this time, she wouldn't run. This time, she would be ready. And she wouldn't be alone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the world in a warm golden glow, the queen turned to the human. They sat by the fire, their shoulders touching, the silence between them comfortable and familiar. "I want to build something new," she said quietly, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "A place where no one is judged by their species or their past. A place where strength is measured by the heart, not by power." The human looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Then we'll build it together." Those words, simple and sincere, filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Together. It was a concept foreign to her, but now it was the foundation of everything she wanted. They began reaching out to nearby human settlements, sharing knowledge and forging alliances. The queen's understanding of advanced technology, combined with the humans' deep connection to the land, created a unique blend of innovation and tradition. They taught humans how to defend themselves against future threats, while also learning from their resilience and resourcefulness. Word of their partnership spread, attracting others, humans and even aliens from distant worlds, who sought refuge from oppression and tyranny. A new community was born, one that stood as a testament to what could be achieved when differences were set aside in favor of unity. The queen no longer wore a crown, but she was still a leader. Not through fear or dominance, but through respect and trust. And by her side stood the man who had shown her the true meaning of strength. As the years passed, the queen often found herself looking back on that fateful day when her ship had crashed on Earth. What had once felt like the end had become a new beginning, one she never could have imagined. And every time she looked at the human, she knew that the universe had a strange way of bringing the right people together. They had saved each other, and together they would change the galaxy.